The first scream that tore through the Arizona twilight wasn't human. It was the howl of a wolf, a sound of wild, ancient hunger that promised a swift and brutal end to anything caught in its path. But the second scream was that of a child, small, terrified, and utterly alone, on a desolate patch of land claimed only by rattlesnakes and regret, a lone pregnant woman. Abigail Rose Thornton heard both calls. Armed with a single-shot rifle, a dying lantern, and a grief so heavy it was a second person in her half-built cabin, she had to make a choice. What happened between that sunset and the next sunrise would become a legend, whispered in two different languages, a story of how a mother's courage forged a bond stronger than steel and bought her a piece of the very land that was trying to kill her. The heat of the day in the Serbet Canyon of 1878 didn't so much leave as it was violently shoved aside by a chilling high desert cold. The sun bled out across the western mesas, painting the sky in brutal hues of orange and purple, a beautiful wound that offered no comfort to Abigail Rose Thornton. She stood in the doorway of her unfinished cabin, a silhouette of stubborn survival. Her belly was swollen with the life of her unborn child, a constant rolling reminder of the future her husband Thomas would never see. Thomas. The name was a phantom limb, an ache she felt with every gust of wind that rattled the unchinked logs of their home. He'd been a surveyor, a man who saw poetry in lines and angles, who believed they could carve a life from this unforgiving landscape. He saw a future where others saw only dust and danger. Then a rock slide during a survey of the Dragoon foothills had turned his future into her past. He'd been gone 3 months. The U.S. Army patrol from Fort Huachuca had delivered the news with practiced, empty sympathy, offering her a wagon ride back to Tucson. She had refused. This land, this half-built cabin, was the last tangible piece of him she had. His tools lay where he'd dropped them, catching the moonlight with a ghostly sheen. His half-finished chair sat by the cold hearth. To leave would be to admit he was truly gone, that their dream had died with him. And so she stayed. A pregnant woman, 20 miles from the nearest semblance of white settlement, a grubby mining outpost called Jasper's Gulch, and surrounded by territory the Apache still considered their sacred own. Her nights were the worst. The silence was a living thing, punctuated by the yip of coyotes and the unnerving hoot of an owl. Loneliness was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Tonight, however, the silence was broken by a new sound. It started low, a single mournful cry that climbed the scale into a chorus. Wolves. A pack. Close. Abigail's hand went instinctively to her belly, a gesture both protective and weary. She'd heard them before, but always in the distance, a wild song on the edge of her world. This was different. This was the sound of a hunt. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She pulled her heavy shawl tighter, her gaze sweeping the darkening landscape. The jagged peaks of the mountains were turning into black teeth against the star-dusted sky. She reached back inside the cabin, and her fingers found the cold, familiar stock of Thomas's Springfield rifle. It was a single-shot, trap-door model, heavy, reliable, and with only 1 round in the chamber. She had 5 other cartridges, tucked away in a small leather pouch, but reloading under pressure was a slow, clumsy affair. Beside the rifle stood a lantern, its oil low casting a weak, flickering circle of courage against the encroaching dark. She was about to bar the heavy plank door when the second scream came. It wasn't a howl. It was a cry. A human cry. Thin, reedy, and choked with pure terror. It was the sound of a child. It came from the direction of the rocky outcrop to the south, a maze of boulders and twisted mesquite that Thomas had warned her about. Snake-bit gully, he'd called it. The sound was cut short, as if a hand had been clapped over a mouth, but she had heard it. There was no mistaking it. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door, bar it and pray for dawn. She was one woman with one bullet against a wolf pack. To go out there was suicide. Her duty was to the child within her, the last piece of Thomas. But the cry echoed in her soul. It was the sound of a little one lost and facing the ultimate terror. How could she, a mother-to-be, cower behind a door while a child was being torn apart by wolves? The question was its own answer. To do nothing would be to lose a piece of herself that was more vital than her own safety. It would be to betray the very meaning of the life she carried. With a shaking hand, she lit the lantern. The flame sputtered, then caught, casting her determined, fear-etched face in a golden glow. She grabbed the rifle. She didn't have a plan. She had only a conviction born of grief and a fierce, burgeoning maternal instinct. "Hold on, little one," she whispered into the vast, hostile darkness. "I'm coming." She stepped out of the cabin, leaving the relative safety of its four walls behind. The lantern light pushed back the shadows a mere 10 feet, creating a tiny mobile island of safety in an ocean of unseen threats. The cold bit at her cheeks. The wolf howls rose again, closer this time, laced with a new, excited impatience. They had their quarry cornered, and Abigail Rose Thornton walked directly toward the sound. The ground was treacherous. Loose rocks shifted under her worn leather boots, and the spiny arms of cholla cactus seemed to reach for her in the gloom. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the form of a wolf, a trick of the light, and her own galloping fear. The howls had stopped, replaced by a more terrifying sound, a series of low, rumbling growls that vibrated through the soles of her feet. They were just ahead. As she rounded a large granite boulder, the lantern light fell upon the scene. It was a small, natural amphitheater of rock. Huddled at the back, his small body pressed into a crevice, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. He was Apache. His straight black hair was held back by a simple leather band, his face streaked with tears and dirt. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, and in his hand he clutched a small, crudely carved wooden horse. He was staring, his dark eyes bit with a terror so profound it stole his breath not at her, but past her. Abigail slowly turned her head. Forming a semicircle at the entrance to the gully were the wolves. There were 6 of them. They were larger than she'd imagined, their bodies lean and corded with muscle. Their fur was a mix of grey and black, perfectly suited to the twilight landscape. Their lips were pulled back in silent snarls, revealing long, yellowed canines. But it was their eyes that held her. They glowed with a feral yellow-green light in the lantern's beam, intelligent, assessing, and utterly without mercy. One stood slightly ahead of the others. He was massive, his chest broad, a long, silvery scar running from his left eye down his muzzle. This was the alpha. Old Scar. She thought the name coming to her unbidden. He met her gaze not with a dumb animal stare, but with a calculated, chilling appraisal. He was weighing her. The woman, the light, the long metal stick in her hands. The boy let out a small whimpering sob. The sound broke the spell. The alpha took a half-step forward, a low growl erupting from his chest. Abigail's mind raced. Running was impossible. They would be on her back in seconds. She had one bullet. One. If she shot the alpha, the pack might scatter, or they might become enraged and swarm her all at once. If she missed, she couldn't afford to miss. "Easy now," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She wasn't sure if she was talking to the wolves or to herself. She slowly, deliberately raised the rifle to her shoulder, the cold metal a shock against her skin. The heavy barrel wavered. She had fired it only a handful of times with Thomas, and her aim was mediocre at best. She aimed at the center of the alpha's chest. Her finger found the trigger. The world narrowed to the wolf, the rifle's sight, and the pounding of her own blood in her ears. But then she looked past the alpha at the boy. He was shaking his knuckles white where he gripped the wooden horse. He wasn't just a generic child. He was a terrified little person, and in that moment, he was hers to protect. Firing the rifle was a gamble, a final desperate act. What if there was another way Thomas had taught her things? Not just how to shoot, but how to observe. Animals fear two things above all else. Abby. His voice echoed in her memory. Fire and the unknown. She had fire. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered the rifle. The alpha watched the movement. His head cocked a flicker of uncertainty in those intelligent eyes. He had expected the loud bang, the flash. This was something else. This was unpredictable. Keeping her eyes locked on the wolf, Abigail knelt down. It was a risky move, making herself smaller, more vulnerable. With one hand still gripping the rifle, she used the other to pick up a long, dry branch of mesquite wood. The wolves shifted their growls, intensifying. They sensed a change. "It's all right, little one," she said softly, her voice carrying to the boy. "You stay right there." She didn't know if he understood her words, but he seemed to understand the calm authority in her tone. He huddled deeper into the rock, watching her. With painstaking slowness, Abigail thrust the end of the branch into the top of the lantern, touching it to the flame. It took a heart-stopping moment to catch, then it flared to life, a sputtering, smoking torch. The wolves fell back a step, their growls turning to nervous whines. The sudden, uncontrolled bloom of light and smoke was alien to them. Abigail stood up, the rifle in one hand, the burning torch in the other. She was now a creature of full and shadow, the light dancing wildly around her, making her seem larger, more menacing. She took a step forward toward the wolves. "Go on now! Get!" she yelled, her voice raw with adrenaline. She thrust the torch forward, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The pack scattered back another few feet, confused and wary. Old Scar, however, held his ground for a moment longer. He stared at her, his scarred face a mask of primal fury and frustrated cunning. He was the king of this domain, and this strange, soft creature was defying him. He let out a single sharp bark, a command to his pack. They didn't attack, but they didn't flee either. They began to circle their yellow eyes, blinking in and out of the darkness beyond her torchlight. The standoff began in earnest. The night deepened. The cold became a physical pain. Abigail's arm ached from the weight of the rifle. The torch burned down, forcing her to light another and then another. Her supply of dry wood was limited to what she could reach without turning her back on the pack. Her body screamed with exhaustion. The baby shifted inside her, a heavy, demanding weight. Hours crawled by. The wolves tested her relentlessly. One would feint a charge from the left, forcing her to swing the torch in its direction, while another crept closer on the right. Old Scar was a patient general, probing for any sign of weakness, any flicker of the flame, any waver in her resolve. She spoke to the boy, her voice a low, constant murmur. "My name is Abigail. What's yours?" She knew he likely didn't understand. "My Thomas, my husband. He would have loved this land. He said it had good bones." She talked about her home back in Missouri, about the color of the trees in autumn, about the child she was carrying. The words were for the boy, but they were also for herself, a fragile thread of normalcy and sanity in a world that had gone mad. At one point, the boy, lulled by her voice and overcome by exhaustion, began to nod off. As his eyes fluttered shut, a wolf on the periphery chose that moment to charge. It was a younger male, bolder and more impatient than the alpha. It came in low and fast, a grey streak of death. There was no time to think. Abigail reacted on pure instinct. She swung the rifle like a club, catching the wolf on the side of its head with the solid wood of the stock. There was a sickening thud and a yelp of pain. The wolf tumbled back, dazed and whimpering. The attack electrified the rest of the pack. Their growls rose to a fever pitch. Old Scar lunged forward, not at her, but at the injured wolf, snapping and snarling, driving it back into the ranks. It was a brutal display of pack discipline. The message was clear: no unsanctioned attacks. He was in charge. The incident, however, had shaken Abigail to her core. Her arms trembled violently. She had been seconds away from failure. She sank back against the rock face, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart feeling as if it would burst from her chest. The torchlight flickered, threatening to die. The boy was awake again, his eyes fixed on her. He saw her fear her exhaustion. Slowly, tentatively, he crept out from his hiding place. He moved to a small pile of dry sticks and twigs just behind her, gathered them up in his small arms, and shuffled forward, placing them at her feet. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. In that moment, they were no longer a white woman and an Apache boy. They were two souls in the darkness, fighting for the same sunrise. A fragile alliance had been forged. Bolstered by his small act of courage, Abigail found a new reserve of strength. She fed the torch, its light flaring brightly once more. She stood her ground, the silent boy a small shadow at her back. Together they watched the glowing eyes circle in the darkness and waited for the dawn. The first hint of morning was not a light, but a lessening of the dark. A faint grey wash seeped into the eastern sky, slowly diluting the oppressive black of night. With the coming of the light, the confidence of the wolves began to wane. The pack grew restless. Old Scar gave one last, long, frustrated look at the strange, fire-wielding woman and the boy she guarded. With a low woof, he turned and trotted into the shadows, his pack melting away behind him like phantoms. They were gone. The relief that washed over Abigail was so total, it almost brought her to her knees. Her arms, which had felt like lead, now trembled uncontrollably. The rifle slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the rocks. The torch sputtered out its last wisp of smoke, rising into the cool morning air. She leaned her head back against the cold stone, closing her eyes, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. A small, hesitant touch on her arm made her open them. The Apache boy was looking up at her, his large, dark eyes holding a mixture of awe and concern. He pointed to himself. "Taza," he said, his voice quiet. "Taza." Abigail repeated, a weak smile touching her lips. She pointed to her own chest. "Abigail." Taza nodded. He then reached out and gently patted her swollen belly. A look of simple, childish curiosity was on his face. Abigail's smile widened. It was the first moment of genuine human connection she'd felt in months. The moment was shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats. Abigail scrambled for her rifle, her heart leaping back into her throat. A dozen Apache warriors on horseback appeared at the mouth of the gully, materializing from the landscape as if by magic. They were not the stuff of dime novels. They were grim, powerful men. Their faces were set like stone, their eyes hard. They carried rifles and bows, and the morning sun glinted off the lance heads. They were a search party, and they had found what they were looking for. Their leader, a man with a severe face and a hawk-like nose, dismounted. His eyes took in the scene, the white woman looking disheveled and shawled, the boy Taza standing beside her, her rifle on the ground. He saw the wolf tracks, the scorch marks from her torches, but his expression remained a mask of cold suspicion. Taza ran to him, speaking in a rapid torrent of Apache. He gestured wildly, pointing at Abigail, then at the rocks where the wolves had been mimicking her, swinging the torch and clubbing the wolf with her rifle. The warrior who Taza called Nahilzai listened, his gaze never leaving Abigail. He was Taza's uncle, the boy's protector in the absence of his father. When Taza finished, Nahilzai said something sharp to him, and the boy fell silent, his shoulders slumping. The other warriors dismounted, their movements economical and menacing. One of them picked up Abigail's rifle. Another took her by the arm, his grip like iron. She didn't resist. There was no point. Through a mixture of gestures and the few Spanish words they shared, she tried to explain. Lobos, noche, fuego, wolves, night, fire. Nahilzai was unmoved, a white woman alone in their territory, found with the son of the chief. The circumstances were too strange, too suspicious. In his mind, a far more likely scenario was taking shape. She was a kidnapper, a lure, part of some white man's trick. The wolves were a convenient story. They tied her wrists loosely in front of her, a concession perhaps to her condition, and put her on a horse. Taza was placed in front of his uncle. As the party turned to leave, Taza looked back at Abigail, his expression one of confusion and distress. He had tried to tell them she was a hero, but they had not listened. The journey to the Apache stronghold, or rancheria, was a grim, silent affair. It was nestled deep within a hidden canyon, a place no map from Fort Huachuca could ever find. It was a world away from the solitary confinement of her cabin. The camp was a sprawling, living community of wickiups domed dwellings made of brush and hides. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat and horses. Children stopped their games to stare at her, the strange white woman being brought in like a captive. Women paused their work, grinding corn or scraping hides, their faces impassive, but their eyes filled with a deep ancestral distrust. She was taken to the largest wickiup at the center of the camp. Nahilzai pushed aside the hide flap and shoved her inside. The interior was dim lit by the sunlight filtering through a smoke hole at the top. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and smoke. Seated on a pile of buffalo robes was a man who commanded the space simply by his presence. He was older, his face a magnificent landscape of wrinkles and scars, each line telling a story of war, wisdom, and sorrow. His hair was long and grey, and his eyes, dark and piercing, held the weight of a man responsible for the survival of his people. This was Chief Mangas Taza's father. His gaze fell on Abigail, and it was as cold and hard as the winter earth. At his side, Taza was already talking, his small voice filled with urgency. Mangas listened, his expression unreadable. When Taza finished, the chief spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. He spoke in Apache, but the tone was universal. It was the voice of a grieving father who had spent a night believing his only son was dead. It was the voice of a leader who saw a threat to his people in the form of the woman standing before him. Nahilzai spoke, then laying out his suspicions. He pointed at Abigail using the Spanish word for trickster embustera. He suggested she was working with the miners from Jasper's Gulch, that this was some elaborate ploy. Abigail stood straight, her fear battling with a rising tide of indignation. After everything she had done, everything she had risked to be accused of such a thing was a bitter pill. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. She looked directly at Chief Mangas. "Your son was alone. The wolves had him cornered. I kept them back. All night." She held up her hands, showing him the scratches and the soot. "Look at the tracks. Look at the boy. He is not hurt. He tells you the truth." Mangas considered her words, his dark eyes boring into hers, searching for a flicker of deceit. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the small fire in the center of the lodge. The fate of Abigail Rose Thornton hung in the balance, suspended between the word of a small boy and the ingrained distrust of a people who had been given every reason to hate her kind. The chief's face was unreadable, a stone tablet of history and pain. He was about to speak when a commotion from outside the wickiup interrupted him. A warrior burst in his face, urgent. He spoke rapidly to Mangas. The chief's expression darkened further. He rose to his feet, a silent command for Abigail and Nahilzai to follow. Stepping back out into the harsh sunlight, Abigail saw what had caused the disturbance. Riding into the center of the Apache camp, arrogant and uninvited, were 3 white men. And leading them was a man she knew all too well, Silas Cutter. Chief Mangas was about to deliver his judgment, the words forming behind his stern lips, when a new sound intruded upon the sacred quiet of his lodge. It was a disturbance from without, the agitated stamping of horses, the harsh, unfamiliar cadence of a white man's voice raised in arrogant command, and the low, dangerous murmur of the warriors responding to the intrusion. A young brave, his face a mask of urgency, burst through the hide flap of the wickiup. He spoke in a torrent of Apache, his words painting a picture of an unwelcome arrival. A cold knot of dread formed in Abigail's stomach. She knew with a certainty that defied logic who it was. There was only one man audacious and foolish enough to ride into an Apache camp as if he owned it. Mangas rose, his movements deliberate and imbued with an authority that seemed to make the very air in the lodge grow heavy. He gestured for Abigail and Nahilzai to follow. As she stepped back out into the blinding sunlight, her eyes took a moment to adjust. The scene before her was even worse than she had imagined. There, in the center of the clearing, surrounded by a bristling ring of silent, wary warriors, sat Silas Sill Cutter on his sweat-stained mare. He was flanked by 2 hired guns she recognized from the filth of Jasper's Gulch. A gaunt, rat-faced man called Pike, and a hulking, slow-witted brute known only as Lefty. Cutter was dressed in what he clearly considered his finest negotiating attire, a dusty black coat, a stained silk vest, and a cocky smirk that was an insult all by itself. He was an infection, a pustule of greed and ambition that had just burst into the heart of the Apacheria. He swung down from his horse with a theatrical creak of leather, his boots landing in the dust with a thud of unearned confidence. He ignored the dozens of arrows and rifle barrels aimed loosely in his direction, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Abigail, standing beside the chief. A triumphant, predatory gleam lit his face. "Well now, Chief Mangas." Cutter began his voice, a slick, oily substance that coated every word. He swept his hat from his head in a mocking bow. "I see you've found my stray little lamb. I do apologize for all this trouble. She can be a bit impulsive." Abigail's blood ran cold. His stray. The lie was so immediate, so complete, it took her breath away. She could only stare her mind, struggling to comprehend the depth of his treachery. Chief Mangas stepped forward, his expression as hard and unreadable as the granite cliffs that surrounded them. "This woman was found on our sacred land, with my son." "Exactly!" Cutter boomed, seizing the statement and twisting it to his purpose. He took a step closer, adopting a conspiratorial tone, as if he and the chief were partners in some grand enterprise. "A terrible, regrettable misunderstanding, but one born of good intentions, I assure you. You see poor Abigail here," he said, the false pity in his voice making her stomach turn. "She's been beside herself with grief since her husband passed. A lonely widow. I've been looking out for her, providing for her, and she wanted to repay my kindness." He gestured expansively at Abigail, painting her as his pathetic, indebted pawn. "We talked, see. We both know you Apaches are, well, you're a proud people. Hard to get to the talking table. But we also know the love you have for your children. It's admirable. So we developed a plan. A bit of harmless theater. If she could just borrow the boy for a day or so, get your attention, we knew you'd be willing to sit down and talk. Man to man. About a mutually beneficial business proposition. The lie was a masterpiece of venomous artistry. It was a snake wrapping itself around the truth and squeezing it to death. It accounted for her presence, painted her as a willing co-conspirator, and neatly positioned him as the mastermind, the deal-maker. Inside Abigail's mind, a storm of fury was raging. She felt the memory of the wolf's breath, the terror in Taza's eyes, the bone-deep exhaustion of her vigil. And now this vile creature was claiming it all as some cheap, sordid ruse. Nahilzai let out a low grunt. He shot a look at Mangas that said, "I told you so." The white man's words were a poison that confirmed his every suspicion. It was all a white man's trick, and this woman was the bait. "Negotiate what?" Mangas asked, his voice dangerously quiet, betraying none of the turmoil within. He was watching every flicker of Cutter's eyes, every drop of sweat on his brow. "Progress, my good chief, and profit." Cutter's voice lowered, becoming thick with avarice. "There's a rich vein of silver in these hills. I've seen the signs. Enough to make us all wealthy men. I have the equipment, the connections. You have the access. I get the mining rights, and you and your people get a share. A generous share, of course. No more empty bellies in the winter. All we needed was an invitation to this council. The woman and the boy. They were that invitation." "He lies," the words erupted from Abigail, raw and shaking with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. She stepped forward, breaking the space between herself and the chief. "Every word from his mouth is poison. I have never spoken to this man about any plan. He tried to swindle me out of my land after my husband died. I found Taza alone. I saved him." Cutter merely chuckled, a condescending, greasy sound that grated on the nerves. Now, Abby. Don't get hysterical. And don't you go ruining a perfectly good business deal out of some misplaced stage fright. You played your part beautifully." He gave her a slow, deliberate wink, a gesture of shared conspiracy so vile and so public that it was meant to seal her fate. Chief Mangus was caught in a crucible of doubt. On one side was this smug, confident man, whose story, while despicable, fit the pattern of deceit the chief had come to expect from the Nakai. Yes, the white men. On the other was this woman, her eyes blazing with a desperate, furious sincerity, backed only by the frantic gestures of his own small son, who was now clinging to his father's leg, pointing at Cutter, and shaking his head vehemently. The balance was tipping against her. It was her word against his, and his was a story of greed, a motive the Apache understood all too well. Then a memory of Thomas, clear and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced through her panic. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all she had left. "My husband," she said, her voice cutting through Cutter's smug aura, forcing both him and Mangus to look at her. Thomas was a surveyor for the government. He didn't just look at the land, he documented it. He drew maps of every hill, every stream, every canyon in this territory. They are in my cabin in his chest. They are filled with his notes. She locked her eyes on Mangus, pleading with him to understand. If this man Cutter had a plan for Silver, if he had any arrangement with me, there would be some record of it. A mark on a map, a note in a journal. Something. I dare you to look. Send your men. Get the maps. You will find nothing but lines and numbers. You will find no mention of Silas Cutter. You will find no proof of his lies, because they were born this very morning in his black heart. A flicker of pure animal panic flashed across Cutter's face before he could mask it. Maps, journals, physical proof. His entire scheme was built on lies and air, and she had just threatened to bring stone and paper into it. He had no idea what the dead surveyor might have written. What if Thomas had documented his lowball offers, his threats? The risk was too great. That's ridiculous! Cutter blustered, his voice losing its smooth, confident rhythm. A woman's sentiment. There's no need to go riding all over creation, bothering with a dead man's scribbles. This deal is between you and me, Chief. A handshake between two powerful men. But the crack in his composure had been noted. Mangus had seen the flicker of fear. It was the first hard piece of evidence he had. He turned to his war chief. "Nahilzai," he commanded in the Apache tongue. "Take 2 warriors, ride to the woman's cabin. Bring back this chest of maps." The command was a death sentence to Cutter's plan. He watched Nahilzai gesture to 2 warriors, who immediately began moving toward their horses. The web of his lies was unraveling with terrifying speed. In a few hours, they would have the maps, and his story would be exposed. His silver dream would vanish, and he would be left here at the mercy of 100 warriors he had tried to deceive. Desperation clawed at his throat. He had to stop them. He had to regain control. And Silas Cutter only knew one way to do that. "I said, hold on!" He roared, the mask of civility melting away to reveal the snarling beast beneath. His hand, slick with sweat, dropped to the butt of the Colt pistol at his hip. It was a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. The air in the clearing, already thick with tension, seemed to solidify. Cutter was fast, But he was a saloon brawler, not a warrior. The Apache moved with the collective instinct of a wolf pack. Before Cutter's pistol had even cleared the top of its holster, Nahil's eye moved. He was not a man, but a blur of vengeful motion. At the same instant, Pike and Lefty, seeing their employer's suicidal move, fumbled for their own weapons. Lefty never had a chance. A warrior beside him slammed the heavy wooden stock of a Springfield rifle into his jaw with a sickening crack of bone. Pike managed to draw his revolver, but as he raised it, another warrior launched himself from the side, not attacking Pike, but his horse. The warrior slammed his shoulder into the animal's flank, causing it to rear in panic. Pike fired a single shot harmlessly into the sky before he was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in the dust. Cutter, in his panic, managed to fire his Colt. The shot was wild, aimed not at any one person, but at the general authority of the chief. The bullet screamed past Mangus's head, splintering the main pole of his wickiup with a loud crack. That gunshot signed his fate. It was a direct attack on the chief. It was an act of war. Nahil Zai, who had been closing the distance with the speed of a striking snake, didn't even draw his knife's edge. He spun the weapon in his hand, and with a grunt of exertion brought the heavy pommel crashing down against Cutter's right temple. The sound was a dull, wet thud. Cutter's eyes rolled back in his head. His finger went limp on the trigger, and he collapsed like a sack of grain, his face ploughing into the dirt he so coveted. The entire explosion of violence lasted less than 10 seconds. A profound silence descended, broken only by Lefty's groaning and the panicked snorting of the horses. The dust began to settle. The Apache warriors stood over their fallen, disarmed opponents, their chests heaving, their eyes burning with cold fire. Chief Mangus stood perfectly still, his face like carved stone. He walked slowly to where Cutter lay, an unconscious, bleeding heap of thwarted greed. He looked down at the man for a long moment, then nudged him contemptuously with the toe of his moccasin. His face held no triumph, only a deep, weary disgust. Then slowly he turned his gaze to Abigail. He looked at her defiant stance, her blazing eyes, the fierce protectiveness with which she shielded her body. He looked at his son Taza, who had run to her side and now clutched her dress. He saw it all then. The truth clear and bright as the Arizona sun. The truth was not in the words, but in the actions, in the courage, in the heart. He walked to her, his immense presence seeming to block out the rest of the world. He stood before her, and she met his gaze without flinching. He reached out with both hands not toward her, but to the rough leather cord that still bound her wrists. With a single sharp tug, he snapped the bond. Her hands were free. The weight of suspicion, which had been as heavy as any iron shackle, fell away with it. As Silas Cutter and his men were hauled away, their groans and curses swallowed by the vast indifference of the canyon, a strange quiet fell over the Apache camp. The electric tension that had crackled in the air, threatening to ignite a massacre, dissipated into the thin, sun-drenched atmosphere. The Apache warriors, who moments before had been vessels of lethal intent, now stood relaxed but watchful, their expressions shifting from hardened suspicion to a complex mixture of curiosity and respect as their eyes fell upon Abigail. The whispers started then, a low murmur rippling through the onlookers, the women, the elders, the wide-eyed children. The story was solidifying, passing from rumor into the first stage of legend. The white woman had not been a trickster. She had been a shield. Chief Mangus stood for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the spot in the dust, where Cutter had fallen as if purging the man's vile presence from the sacred ground of his home. Then he turned, and his eyes found Abigail. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not a command, but an invitation. He began walking back toward his wickiup, and this time Abigail followed not as a captive, but as a guest of honor. Nahilzai fell into step beside her, a silent, imposing escort. There was no hand on her arm now. The space he kept was one of respect, not restraint. Taza, his small hand, still firmly gripping two of her fingers, trotted along with them, a living bridge between two worlds. As she passed through the heart of the rancheria, she felt the change. The hard stares had softened. The women no longer looked at her as a threat to their children, but with a new understanding, a shared recognition of the protective instinct that transcended race and language. They saw the swell of her belly, the exhaustion etched on her face, and the dried blood on her knuckles where she had clubbed the wolf, and they understood. Inside the chief's lodge, the air was cool and smelled of sea and old smoke. It felt like a sanctuary from the violent glare of the sun. Mangus gestured for her to sit on a pile of soft hides, a place of comfort. An elderly woman, her face a beautiful map of deep-creased wrinkles, and her grey hair in two long braids, entered silently. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of one who has performed the same rituals for a lifetime. She carried a clay gourd, cool to the touch, and a wooden bowl. She knelt before Abigail, offering the water first. Abigail drank the water, tasting cleaner and sweeter than any she had ever known. It was more than hydration. It felt like a cleansing, washing away the dust, the fear, and the lingering taint of Cutter's lies. The woman then offered the bowl. It was a thick, hearty stew of venison maize and wild squash, seasoned with herbs Abigail didn't recognize. As she ate, the warmth spread through her, chasing away the deep, bone-aching chill of the long night. The food was a balm, and with each spoonful she could feel her strength seeping back, her trembling limbs steadying. She ate slowly, aware of the 3 pairs of eyes on her. The innocent curiosity of the boy, the guarded respect of the warrior, and the profound assessing wisdom of the chief. When she had scraped the last of the stew from the bowl, the old woman took it with a slight nod and disappeared as silently as she had arrived. For a long time, only the sound of the small central fire crackling broke the silence. Mangus seemed to be gathering not just his thoughts, but the very words themselves, as if drawing them from a deep well he seldom visited. Finally he spoke. His English was slow, each word chosen with the care of a man placing stones across a rushing river. "The tongue of the white man," he began, his gaze distant, fixed on the dancing flames, "is a tool of many edges. It can build a bridge of understanding, or it can be a blade that carves a wound of betrayal. My people have felt its edge more often than its embrace. We have learned that promises made in your language often vanish like the morning mist." He turned his gaze from the fire to her. It was heavy, not with accusation, but with the weight of history. This man Cutter, he spoke with that forked tongue. He wove a story from greed and deceit, thinking we were simple people who would be dazzled by his shining lies. He saw land as dirt to be owned, and people as tools to be used. I have known 100 men like him. They are a plague upon the earth. The chief leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes boring into hers, seeking to understand the anomaly she represented. But your actions spoke a different language, an older one, the language of the heart. My son told us you built a wall of fire. Nahilzai's warriors found the tracks. The great wolf Shushay Shish, the scarred one. His pack has not been challenged in that canyon for many seasons. They are cunning and fear nothing. Yet you, one woman, with the life of your own child to protect you, did not run." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet lodge. A warrior fights to protect his people. A mother fights to protect her child. These are the two strongest truths I know. Last night in Snakebit Gully, you were both. You have the spirit of a warrior and the heart of a mother. My people and I, we honor this." Abigail felt a hot flush of tears prick her eyes, but she willed them back. This was a moment that demanded strength, not sentimentality. "My husband, Thomas," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "He told me that this land had a story. He said it wasn't ours to take only to live with. He said the Apache understood that story. I believe he was right." A rare, faint smile touched the corners of Mangus's mouth. "Your husband was a man who saw with his soul, not just his eyes. Such men are few. His wisdom lives on in you." The chief rose with a fluid movement that belied his age and went to a weathered wooden chest in the corner of the wickiup. He lifted the lid, and from within he withdrew a cylinder of tanned buckskin tied with a dark leather thong. He returned and knelt, unrolling it carefully on the hide between them. It was a map, but unlike any Abigail had ever seen. It was not a sterile grid of lines and numbers. It was a living document, a tapestry of a people's existence drawn in charcoal and pigments of red ochre and yellow clay. It showed the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, the winding path of the San Pedro River, the locations of sacred caves, hidden springs, and ancient hunting grounds. It was a map of memory and soul. Mangus placed a long, weathered finger on a particular spot. It was a small, sheltered area, cradled by a bend in a canyon precisely where a tall, distinctive peak cast a long shadow every afternoon. Abigail recognized it instantly. It was her land, her cabin. "The men in Washington have their papers," Mangus said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "They call them deeds and titles. They believe that by putting marks on a dead tree, they can claim ownership of the living earth. It is a strange and hollow magic. A paper can be burned, a promise made between honorable people. That is a thing that lives in the heart. It has true power." He carefully rolled the buckskin map and held it out to her in both hands. "I cannot give you a paper from a white man's government. That is not my right nor my way. But I can give you this. The word of Mangus, chief of the Chiricahua Apache. The land your cabin stands on, from the Whispering Creek to the 3 sister stones in the west, all that falls within the mountain's afternoon shadow. It is yours. You will live there in peace. My warriors will know it as a protected place. The hunters will leave you a share of their kill. The women will show you which plants give medicine and which give food. No harm will come to you or the child you carry from my people. You are no longer a stranger here. You are a neighbor." He pressed the scroll into her hands. "This is our promise, our paper. We will call it the Deed of the Mountain's Shadow." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the soft, supple hide in her hands. It was infinitely more valuable than any paper deed filed in Tucson. That was a claim of ownership. This was a covenant of belonging. It wasn't a title to a piece of dirt. It was an invitation into a community, a promise of sanctuary in the most dangerous land she had ever known. "I have no words," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "Words are not needed." Mangas replied, his eyes kind. Live. Be strong. Raise your child to have a true heart. That will be thanks enough. The journey back was a world removed from the grim march of the morning. Nahilzai and 2 other silent, formidable warriors rode as her escort. They were not her guards, but her guardians. They moved with a silent, easy confidence, and as they left the hidden rancheria, the Apache people watched her go, not with hostility, but with a quiet, powerful acknowledgement. When they arrived at her clearing, she saw that she had not been the only one to receive the tribe's favor. A group of Apache women had been there. The work was a quiet miracle. The gaps between the logs of her half-finished cabin, which had let in the wind and the cold, were now neatly and expertly chinked with a plaster of river mud and dried grass. A tall, orderly pile of firewood enough for many weeks was stacked against the outer wall. Inside her water barrel was full, and a small clay pot of fragrant herbs. A soothing tea, Nahilzai explained with a gesture simmered gently over the embers she had left in her hearth. They had not just repaired her shelter, they had made it a home. As the warriors turned their horses to leave their duty done, Nahilzai paused. He sat on his pony, looking at her at the fortified cabin, his stern face etched with a complex emotion. He, the one who had been so certain of her guilt, now had to reckon with the depth of his misjudgment. A warrior's pride was a formidable thing, but so was a warrior's honor. He dismounted and approached her. He reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and drew something out. Without a word, he pressed it firmly into her palm. It was a small carving, no bigger than her thumb, fashioned from a piece of dark, heavy ironwood. It was a wolf. Its head tilted back, its mouth open in a silent, defiant howl. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Every line of muscle, every tuft of fur carved with patient skill. It was not a toy. It was a totem, a symbol of a great and worthy adversary, a creature of power and wild spirit. By giving it to her, Nahilzai was offering her more than a gift. He was giving her a warrior's ultimate compliment. He was acknowledging her spirit as equal to the beast she had faced. He met her eyes for a brief, intense moment, gave a single sharp nod, and swung back onto his horse. Within seconds, he and the other warriors had vanished back into the landscape, as silent and swift as they had appeared. Abigail stood alone in the doorway of her transformed home, the ironwood wolf still cool and heavy in one hand, the Apache deed clutched in the other. The sun was beginning its descent, and just as the chief had described, a long, benevolent shadow from the highest mountain peak crept across the canyon floor, enveloping her cabin in its cool, protective embrace. She looked out at the vast, wild land that had tried to claim her life, the land that had taken her husband. It was no less dangerous, no less wild. But it was no longer alien. She had found her place within its story. She was no longer just Thomas's widow waiting to fade away. She was Abigail Rose Thornton, the woman who stood against the wolves, the neighbor to the Apache, the keeper of the deed of the mountain's shadow. And as she placed a hand on her belly, feeling the strong, steady flutter of the new life within, she knew her child would not be born into a world of loneliness and fear, but into a home forged by fire, courage, and the most unlikely and unbreakable of promises. The story of Abigail Rose Thornton isn't just a tale of survival. It's a powerful testament to the idea that courage and compassion are a universal language understood even when words fail. It shows how the fierce instinct of a mother can stare down any predator, whether it walks on 4 legs or 2. In a time and place defined by conflict, Abigail and Chief Mangas proved that honor and respect could build bridges where others only saw borders. Their story reminds us that sometimes our greatest allies come from the most unexpected places. If this story of unlikely heroism in the Old West moved you, please give this video a like. It truly helps our channel grow. Share it with someone who loves a story of real courage. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We share powerful stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for listening.